deep dive?
Deep dive time, people.
Nice. Okay.
It is time.
So we're talking about worker democracy today, which I don't know if you want to give the idea of. I feel like you might be a little bit more eloquent
Sure.
than me on this.
Yeah, I'll talk about worker democracy from this standpoint here and kind of just talk about where it comes from and just the brief types that exist in our current economy. But first, it's a very simple definition, right? Workers having control over their workplaces, at least in some respect. It is really about bringing the Republican values that we've already brought to our government into the workplace. So we have escaped the authoritarianism in our government. We have taken off the shackles of kings, but we have not done so in our economic sector. We live in a democracy, but when we go to work, we're in a tyranny. And how do we change that, right? Managers and owners make all the decisions, and workers aren't involved in those decisions that these enterprises make. What does that mean? It means the decisions that enterprises are making are in the interest of the managers and the owners, and they are not in the interest of the workers because the workers don't have a seat at that table. Mm-hmm. Now, in our current model, right, investors build out the hierarchy of an enterprise. Investors give money into the corporation. They buy shares. They buy ownership stake. They then elect corporate boards. Corporate boards then appoint the managers, and then the managers control all of the workers. Well, in a worker-controlled enterprise or an enterprise that embraces some form of worker democracy, the workers are putting their influence inside of that corporate board, which is then dictating how the company is being run, and it's almost like they're running themselves in a way. The same way you can picture a democratic or constitutional republic, that is where this goes. So there are three types of worker-owned enterprises that we're going to really be talking about. Worker cooperatives, which is very, very straightforward, of one member, one vote principle of workers owning the enterprise together and share the profits in some level. Control, though, may differ. Then there is businesses who give their workers shares in a company, and then these workers can then vote with these shares that the company gives them. And then the last is codeterminism, which is very, very popular throughout parts of Europe. Is there anything you want to add from there?
Well, yes, two things. So I'll just give some terminology to the type of business where there are programs for the workers to own shares. Usually there's a trust that manages the share ownership, and the employees pay into the trust, and then they own some of the shares of the company. These are generally called companies with employee stock ownership programs, and so they're called ESOPs, and I just want to put that out there so we can use that moving on.
Very glad.
I want to define what codetermination.
Oh yeah, please. I skipped over that one.
Yeah. So basically, Anthony mentioned how in a lot of the traditional companies we talk about or we think about, we have corporate boards that are elected by the shareholders and the owners that oversee everything. In codetermined companies, there are a certain number of the board seats that oversee everything that are allocated to positions for workers and for people who are elected by the workers.
Yes.
So there is some level of the oversight of the management that workers are necessarily involved in.
Yeah. And I want to kind of talk about why we can start with the benefits of worker democracy generally, but this actually applies very specifically to the rise of codeterminism. So, Friedrich Hayek, who was a neoliberal, who was not somebody who would be for codeterminism or worker ownership in the sense that we're talking about here today, but he gives a really interesting economic problem that he thinks that centralized authorities, specifically governments, can't solve for. He's a large critic of centralized authorities trying to coordinate all these different economic units, because these centralized authorities cannot regularly observe what is going on the ground. So they can't determine what is best for each individual consumer or economic actor. This is one of his largest critiques of Soviet communism, of Sovietism. And he suggests that markets are simply the only way to coordinate these large-scale systems, because no one can master all of the information of all of these different economic units. This is also called the socialist calculation problem. Well, James Scott, who was an anarchist, took Friedrich Hayek's analysis of the issues with centralized authority and then brought those same premises to a different conclusion. He takes that exact same framework and then he throws it back in the corporation's face. He says these top-down organizations in general, not just governmental organizations, these corporations fail to understand the realities of economic life. And because the rule makers so often don't see the effects of the rules they implement, shareholders are actually a poor controller of corporate boards and corporate governance structures, where workers who live the day-to-day life, who see it firsthand, really do have a larger benefit and a larger ability to give actually good input into how to run the company itself. It's kind of solving for that socialist calculation problem.
Yeah, so I have two ideas on this. One is that in a paper that I read, the anecdotes largely support that idea, where the benefit of having an employee represented board seat or board seats is that there's better communication and understanding on both sides of each other. The employees get more insight into the ideas and strategies and goals of the shareholders, and vice versa. The shareholders can more understand what's going on within the company because of the workers. On the other hand, I would wonder, or I would argue about whether the shareholders really care about. I think they care about the information about what's going on in their company, but they don't really care about the perspective of what's good for the workers.
Right. No, they have no interest.
Exactly.
And because they have no interest, it's why it's important to get them on corporate boards, so they can at least rally for their own interest.
Yes.
Now, I want to stick on codeterminism for a second, and then maybe we could run down co-ops and just share ESOPs.
And ESOPs, yeah.
Yeah, so let's talk about codeterminism. I want to talk about the study that was done in Germany, and they were trying to see if firms that practiced codeterminism and firms that didn't practice codeterminism had different results with competitiveness and profitability. Well, they found that there was no difference with competitiveness or profitability. And the way that they found this was a German law was passed in 1994 that did not require new companies of a specific size that were smaller to practice this type of worker representation. Mm-hmm. So by comparing older firms who of the same size and newer firms of the same size, it was not clear it was not clear that that workers on the corporate boards affected any type of competitiveness or profitability with the company. It also showed, though, that it did not show any increase in workers' wages.
Yeah.
Which is important to recognize. Codeterminism does not specifically increase workers' wages. That's what we've seen so far in the literature. The same thing was also found in Finland.
Yes, the literature has shown that in multiple cases. Some analysis of that literature that I've seen is because every case of legally ordained codeterminism, which basically means these companies have to have a certain number of their seats elected by their workers, they never give the workers the majority power.
I love the way you're going with that. That's exactly right. The workers operate more as a supervisor to what the shareholders are deciding, rather than an active partner in shaping deep company policy and investment strategies.
Okay, I wouldn't go that far.
Okay,
that's not what I read. Okay, where I'm trying to go is more like the worker elected representatives are in these boardrooms and they are listening and they are participating in the conversations. So what I've read about the situation on boards with codetermination, where maybe half, probably less, are represented by the workers, is that they are involved in discussions, and more often than not, the boards are coming to consensus decisions. The problem is they're coming to those decisions with the context in the back of everyone's mind that the shareholder representative board members can always outvote the worker representative board members. So it is nice because they do have input into the discussions, right? But whether it's because they know that they have that disadvantage in the vote, or whether they know that what's good for the company overall is generally good for the workers.
Right.
Generally is good for the workers.
I have read anecdotes of people in, like, this is like a magazine article talking about codeterminism, and there were some anecdotes of people suggesting, like, I feel like he was a worker representative on a corporate board, and he basically said, he's like, I feel like I'm just watching. He's
Yes.
like, I might as well be a camera.
Yeah.
Like that's how he felt. He's like, I might as well be a camera, and then the workers could just go and watch what happened in the meetings. Right.
I've heard that too.
Yeah, he felt like he wasn't making much of a difference. And it's good that you pointed out that this is because of the minority stake that workers have. And socialists in the 1910s and 1920s saw this fear. Social democratic parties in Germany in the 10s and 20s were actually against minority representation on corporate boards.
Because it's going to placate the workers.
Because it was placating the workers and giving too much away to capital.
Yeah.
So they were specifically against this type of codeterminism, which I find really interesting. Because now in the United States, we would fucking eat this off the floor if this came to us.
As far as the progressives, as far as the leftists.
Yeah, as far as the progressive side of the aisle would.
Yeah.
But that's, yeah, so codeterminationism is interesting. I definitely think it's an interesting start to this type of thing.
Well, I really want to ask, do you think that a codetermination agreement where 60% of the board members were elected by workers, would we have significantly different outcomes? Would we see real difference in companies?
That's what I'm so curious about. I honestly don't know.
Like, I don't think so. I think companies would generally still be run in a similar way.
No, I can give you some examples about how a major difference.
Okay.
So this is going to take us to our cooperative conversation.
Sure.
But so if we're going to start going to majority worker owned, now we're getting into co-ops.
Yes.
So what is a worker cooperative? I've said this before. I'll say it again. Worker cooperatives are like when workers collectively own the company. Now, there are some cooperatives that actually sell some of their shares to investors and shareholders, and then some allow them to elect some board members, some don't. So they could be non-voting shares, but they still sell off ownership of their company. So I think a company that has majority worker ownership would operate more like a co-op that is allowing shareholder investment, right? Mm-hmm. So in these companies, one of the big impacts we see is workers less likely to be fired in times of recession and poor revenue. Because when this happens, workers are more likely to take a pay cut than to be fired.
I see.
And they're more fluid with that because workers hold solidarity with one another. And in these cases, they say, okay, let's cut wages by 4% so that we can save everyone's jobs. Here's an example of this in the United States that's not operating with worker ownership. UAW, during the recession, they decided to cut their pay and stop the cost of living increase in wage adjustments, specifically to keep everyone's jobs. I think that would be way more prominent in a majority-owned worker company.
Why do you think traditional companies don't go that route?
I think it's because it's faster to fire and cut out the waste. I also think it's cheaper in the short term.
Okay, it's definitely cheaper in the short term.
Yeah.
Do you think it's because they need to serve up heads to the shareholders?
Oh, yeah, that's a great point.
They need a bigger move for the audience to see.
And I also think it's also psychological warfare against the workers that remain.
Okay.
I totally think it's like you better play your cards right because we're not afraid to fire your ass.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. You better be willing to do more for less. Otherwise.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Off you go.
Okay.
And there's also less inequality in firms that are cooperative. Okay. So there is way less inequality. Here's an example of Uruguay. Uruguay has a massive cooperative. I say massive. It's 2% of the country, but it's a large.
Relatively.
Yeah. Well, relatively.
Yeah.
It's a large cooperative sector, and these guys have a massive difference in compensation between CEOs and the lowest worker.
Okay.
So in the United States, here Mondragon, the most famous co-op that we'll talk about in strict detail in a second here, has a CEO to worker ratio pay of about 20-1. The rest of Spain is 143-1. So there's a lot less inequality in between the firm.
That makes sense.
And that's something that I think would happen in a majority owned or majority elected company.
I'm less sure. Just because of how I think this is where corporate structure comes into play. Mm-hmm. And having even though you have a worker elected board, having a board that is still relatively disconnected from what is below, right? And still having a similarly hierarchical management structure of the company. Yeah. Boards don't do that much day to day. Boards don't, especially the bigger the company gets, obviously, but boards don't make the hiring firing decisions that much of the time.
No,
I think for codetermination, I think you do need something that is more like employee ownership at a large scale to get both more equivalent incomes and less strict firing.
So what you're saying is majority elected worker cooperatives doesn't go far enough in the worker cooperative direction to see the benefits of a worker cooperative in terms of reducing pay between CEO.
Yeah, to see the hopeful benefits.
Okay.
Right?
Yes, I understand.
You need worker ownership more than worker representation on a board.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
And worker ownership solves both problems.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And this is actually a great transition into ESOPs.
Yes.
So do you want to give the explanation of an ESOP?
Yeah. So an ESOP, we mentioned this at the beginning, but an ESOP is an employee stock ownership program. I think the best example that you could think of in the U.S. for anyone watching this is Publix, which is a grocery store that operates mostly in the Southeast. Basically, there's a trust that owns most, if not all, of the stock of a company, and the trust is paid into by the employees so that it can distribute shares to the employees. So the employees are still the ones that own the shares of the company, but it's not like a co-op because it's not necessarily one share, one vote. It's not that all of the employees own equal amounts of shares. It's variable based on how long an employee has been on a company, how much they've wanted to pay into the trust. But it does give them, I think, this is where I'm unclear and I should have done more research, some amount of voting power.
It does.
Okay.
It does. Most ESOPs will. I can't tell you about Publix, but most ESOPs will.
Yeah.
Now, what's also important to talk about is these trusts that are operated on behalf of the workers, most of the time, or at least some of the time, don't have sell-off opportunities. Once you put the money into the trust, you're taking ownership into the company, and it's not like these shares can just be foregoed by the workers and they could all sell off unless you quit or something like that. So these ESOPs, I think, are a very, very viable path to the United States getting some type of worker ownership in the economy.
Yeah.
Because we already have a lot of not share buyback, that's not the right word, stock options programs in the United States.
Yes.
I have stock options with my company. I don't know the exact way that I'm able to vote on everything, but I do know that I'm able to take partial ownership of my company through stock options. And that is a way that the United States could very, very easily transition into a type of worker democratic framework.
Yes.
And now it gets easier for places that are already heavily unionized to go the more Publix route of setting up a specific trust that's run on behalf of the workers.
Yeah.
And that takes up more time, takes up more and more capital over time. But there is one issue with cooperatives that I think is really important to mention.
With cooperatives or with ESOPs?
Sorry.
Or with both?
Sorry. I think this is specifically with cooperatives. But what more do you have to say about ESOPs?
Well, I was going to say something.
Yeah, like the United States and Japan, ESOPs is the way to do it.
Oh, all I was going to say is that ESOPs have been on the rise in the U.S. Because there have been a lot of studies that have come out over the past couple of decades that have shown their benefits, that has shown it means you're going to have better worker retention.
Way
your
better
workers
worker
are going to be more productive. You're going to have a better culture where everyone is way more invested in doing something for the company, which obviously makes sense. So ESOPs are on the rise. Awareness remains the biggest barrier.
Right. Awareness is the biggest barrier.
Yes.
And that's something that we're trying to combat.
Yeah.
Right. That's one of the points.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's why we want to talk about it. It's interesting. So really quickly, as we're about to make the transition from ESOPs to co-ops, one thing I would bring up is how these happen. How are one of these made? Because that's the main thing I was thinking about with worker democracy, right? When I read one paper that kind of is discussing the ideas, the theory behind why you would separate the decision making power from the decision kind of evaluation power. Whereas the shareholders are the decision evaluators and a CEO or the managers of the company are the decision makers.
Right.
And part of the idea was, did I just completely lose my train of thought? I might have just completely lost my train of thought.
Oh, no way. Why is it managerial and overseeing roles separated.
Yeah, no, but I was trying to come from somewhere else. God damn it. Okay.
No way.
No, between ESOPs and okay, no, how these are made. How
they're made.
Yes. So I was starting with ESOPs. It makes more sense with how ESOPs are made to me because you need a profit motive to first establish a company. I just realized I went too far with my train of thought. Yeah, and I couldn't connect it back.
You went way too far.
Yeah, so you need to think, why does someone start a company? Well, because there's massive upside because you get your share of all of the profits of that company, right? And you get to choose how much you're going to allocate those gains and whether you're going to allocate those gains based on ownership of the company. And you're probably going to choose not to do so because then you have more upside, right? Because more of the profits belong to you. So when I was thinking about how co-ops are made, I'm like, this has to be really hard because the risk that the person who starts the business takes on is also enormous, right? Because you could just not be rewarded by the market, right? So it seems to make very little sense to start a co-op up from nothing because you just get so little of the potential rewards.
Well, this brings up a really good point about co-ops, but I want to go right off of that.
Well, I'm gonna start with ESOPs, and why with ESOPs you don't have that problem as much because it's just like going to market with the company. It's like an IPO, except you just sell to the employees. So that's a way that ESOPs are easier to get into. With co-ops, it's still a big problem. And a lot of times co-ops form by just being a bunch of disparate organizations that realize that by joining together and sharing ownership of a bigger organization, they might have better bargaining power as a buyer or as a seller.
Yeah. And so then this brings into how do co-ops get formed? Well, I can go through a list. So co-ops, I've given you the definition, worker owned, kind of one person, one vote. There are a bunch of different things, but it's really the purest form of worker ownership.
The purest form.
Yes. Okay. A lot of studies studying small scale worker co-ops and small scale, regular traditional businesses kind of fall flat because there's a massive amount of selection bias. You have to be very ideological to the to the goal of forming cooperatives to join one. You're going to be way more likely to take reduced pay to keep your company alive, right? So that survivorship bias of cooperatives, especially on that small scale, is a real problem on how we study their effectiveness on that smaller scale.
Totally.
And then that brings into the perfect thing that you were talking about, difference of starting an ESOP and a co-op. If you're going in and you're starting a co-op, you are ideologically committed to that project in a lot of ways. It takes a lot. Now, in France and Italy and Uruguay, these countries actually do a lot to incentivize the creation of co-ops. Northern Italy has a massive cooperative sector, and this goes back to the socialist roots of Northern Italy. So these co-ops are exempted from a lot of corporate taxation. They're exempted from a lot of them. And one of the things that makes them so interesting, that makes it easy to start a co-op in northern Spain, is if your company goes under that you're working for, instead of all the people in that company taking their unemployment benefits and living off of it, all the different employees can use their unemployment benefits to reinvest into the company and buy it outright.
Interesting.
So if a company were to go under in the traditional sense, the employees can say, nope, it's not going under. We're taking our unemployment insurance, we're putting it back into the company, and we're running it ourselves.
Wow.
Which is a really great policy.
That's cool.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah.
And again, but that's survivorship bias, because now we're talking about a lot of people who have such intense loyalty that it's going to be very hard to compare the success of that company to a regular traditional enterprise.
Sure.
But maybe that's also a part of the point, is these people are so loyal to their company that it's one of the benefits. So it's very hard to study this topic.
That out.
Yeah. It's very, very hard. But
Definitely.
Also in France, I want to talk about this. There is a really great, there is a lot of regulation around the French economy that tries to keep co-ops from devouring themselves. Now, I haven't seen evidence that co-ops do devour themselves. I've seen them be very effective, large scale, small scale. They don't seem to do that. But the French tax policy says that a certain percent of the profits of any worker-run enterprise needs to go directly back into the business. And they're trying to keep co-ops alive as much as possible, because these states have a bit of a ideological commitment to creating them.
Yeah.
Which I think the United States could do. And we actually do have a little bit of tax advantages for co-ops in the United States. They're just not utilized.
Yeah.
We actually have them. They do exist.
Well, because again, that it's going to take a choice,
Right.
for someone at some point to give up all of that consolidated power,
Yes.
right? And that's hard, especially in our culture.
Yes.
Which is so much like, let me win.
Right. Let me win. We talk about that was too many I thinks. We think of the businessman as the next frontiersman of the cowboy.
Yeah.
In our culture.
Totally.
Right? But it's really so much different from a cowboy, because a cowboy was alone on the ranch. A businessman is not. He is relying on the people around him just as much as he's relying on himself, whether he knows it or not.
Yeah.
Everyone he hires is intricate to the production. Yeah. So,
well, I think something implicit and not spoken about or paid attention to in the story of the businessman is that he had, like, weirdly, it's like he has figured out and maneuvered his way to be able to use the labor of all of these people to boost himself to this point.
Yes.
To this peak.
Yes.
Right? And so, like,
that's something we're not willing to accept as a culture.
I think, yeah, exactly. And I hear conservatives or economic conservatives talk about how, like, 1 million or 3 million people in America last year made $1 million. You don't think everyone could do that? Everyone could do that if they worked hard enough.
No.
No, they couldn't, because the only reason that 3 million could is because 250 million didn't.
Yes.
Because 250 million boosted them up and allowed them to take more of the money, allowed them to pay the workers less than they created in money.
They are extracting the surplus value from their workers in order to get that high of an income.
Which, again, I'm not completely against, because I think we do need to pay lip service.
Right. There are some societal benefits. There are.
Well, not only societal benefits, like, they take on more risk, right? They make the gamble. They're willing to go out there and do the hard thing of starting the business, of having all the ideas, and of making themselves kind of the person who the buck stops with at every step of the way.
Yes.
That is not easy.
No, but I do think, but then this is when ESOPs come in. When it reaches that certain point of growth, it no longer is that much risk on that person.
True.
And so at that point, it needs to start shifting into a larger collective enterprise organization that is operating for the benefit of all, because that first risk, you've been rewarded. It is now much larger than you and has surpassed anything you could have done on your own, or even your brainchild creation in your notebook.
I kind of like that idea. So some kind of legislation may be saying companies above X number, they become ESOPs.
I love that you're saying this right now, because I have Bernie Sanders' policy proposal from the 2020 presidential election, and it's that.
Really?
Well, I'm going to read it to you outright.
Please.
It's really good, but I will when we're done. That's what I want to end.
Are we not done? I feel like we were getting to a great point.
The last thing I want to end with. Mondragon. Okay? Because these are the downsides of a worker cooperative, and I want to be honest with them. So the firm has grown massively. It was literally 5 guys in the Basque region of Spain. It is now 10,000. I think it's 10,000 workers or something across the globe.
Wow.
And so each one of these cooperatives elect representatives, which then go to an international Mondragon Congress to elect the president. This is causing a lot of problems, because now people feel like their voices aren't actually getting heard. And in addition to this, Mondragon has taken on hiring contractors instead of bringing on people as full employee owners, because they don't want to expand the employee ownership anymore, which is lame as hell.
Yeah.
And so when the 2008 recession hit, they just fired all their contractors, which is like defeating the purpose of a worker cooperative. So there is a lot of room to grow in this space, but this is just one of the most prominent examples. Now, let's end with where the United States can go.
Yeah.
I think we've said that the ESOPs are the best way of the United States to do this. Some type of codeterminationism plus ESOP program is the best way to get this done. So I want to read to you some of the things that Bernie Sanders was proposing in the 2020 presidential campaign. He wants to share corporate wealth with workers. Under his plan, corporations with at least $100 million in annual revenue or corporations with at least $100 million in balance sheet total and all publicly traded companies will be required to provide at least 2% of stock to their workers every year until the company is at least 20% owned by employees. This will be done through the issuing of new shares and the establishment of democratic employee ownership funds. These are the trust funds you were referring to. Next, the funds will enjoy the same voting rights as any other institutional shareholder, and their shares will not be permitted to be transferred or sold. Instead, they will be held permanently in a trust for the workforce. Dividend payments will be made from the funds directly to the employees. This is like a type of profit sharing. Then, 45% of the board of directors in any large corporation with at least $100 million in annual revenue, corporations with at least $100 million in balance sheets total, and all publicly traded companies would be directly elected by the firm's workers, similar to what happens under employee codetermination in Germany, which long has one of the most productive and successful economies in the world. That is incredible that a politician in the United States of America was pushing this type of transformative program on the national stage like this.
I don't think it's enough.
I love that you feel that way.
Well, okay. So first of all, can only add all my thoughts here. I heard the 100 million number. I was like, is that too small? But then you think, okay, pretty much no $100 million company is public. Right. So this is a private company which might have certain private investors. I guess I'm wondering, like, how diluted could that 100 million get?
Right.
Could that 100 million get diluted enough that the people running the company, that it's still small and still has a ton of room for growth in a way that would honestly help the economy, and that you're legitimately removing incentive for the CEO, for the founders that got all this investment and hired all these people by diluting it anymore?
Right.
So that is one question. Another question. The 20% number. Provide at least 2% of the stock to their workers every year until the company is at least 20% owned by employees. Seems too little to me. So I think I want one of these laws to give 51% to the employees. I want to take it to the point where employees can fully own the company. So worst case scenario is they don't like the CEO or the owner of the 49%, the founder. He's put on his ass to do nothing, and he's sitting with 49% of at least $100 million company. In my opinion, probably should be more than $100 million company.
Yeah.
Then, because they have that amount of power, the employees can decide to make it a full co-op, can decide to buy even more of the company from the person, so that we can democratize these even further. But most importantly,
but the shares stop getting issued at 51.
Yes. Yes, they can decide to do more of it themselves then, because you have enough democratic control at that point. And besides, I guess besides that,
the
45 is just connected to what I'm already saying.
If you're saying 51% ownership, the 45 number now becomes irrelevant.
Exactly.
Wow, great stuff, man.
Yeah. If we're gonna do this, let's push,
fucking do it.
Let's push the Overton window.
Yes.
So that we have a real solution.
Yes.
In view.
Hell yeah. So worker democracy, it's really awesome, has its ups and downs, but it will be the future. We'll make sure of it.